It's good to be with you again. It amazes me as I think about the Georgia Salzburger Society that it's been nearly 300 years since the first settlers to Ebenezer arrived, and yet this society continues to thrive. I mean, just seeing the introduction of the new officers, the introduction of the new officers, gave me again a strong sense of the fact that you're a testament to the power of the remembered past, and as a historian, that means everything to me. And I hope it does to you too. As we think about Purrysburg and Ebenezer, Noble asked me to share a little bit about the things that you shared with Purrysburg folks and their interaction with your ancestors in Georgia. And it struck me that immigrants in both places, both in Purrysburg and here in Ebenezer, had a lot in common. As you know, they were near neighbors. Just about 12 miles as the crow flies from Purrysburg to New Ebenezer. So they were the closest neighbors that each other had, really, because Savannah was much further away. And you probably also know that most of the Purrysburg folks came from western Switzerland. Now, a lot of them had immigrated there because of the persecution, religious persecution in France and other parts of Europe. And you were actually near neighbors. If the Purrysburg folks come from this area, here's the valleys of the Salzburg right here. That's less than 300 miles. So they were kind of neighbors even before they came over to each place. Another thing that strikes me is that about half of the Purrysburg folks were German speakers. German Reformed, a few German Lutherans. And so about half of the Purrysburg settlement shared ethnic, if not religious, commonality with a lot of the Ebenezer folks, of course. Immigrants to both communities were motivated to leave their homelands because of religious persecution. Both communities were first settled within a year of each other. Purrysburgers just beat you folks, just by about a year, and the first settlement downriver from here. And of course, they shared for 50 years all the dangers of living on the southern frontier. I mean, this was Indian country. The French were just over the mountains. The Spanish were down in Florida. And of course, the constant threat, especially in South Carolina, but also to some extent in Georgia, of slave rebellion. Those things were always on the forefront of the thinking of folks that lived here because, again, this was really the southern frontier right up until the 1770s, the time of the Revolutionary War. Ebenezer and Purrysburg were fortunate in both cases to have strong, decisive, and single-minded leaders at their founding. And I'm sure you're all very well acquainted with this fellow, Bolzius, Johann Martin Bolzius, who was the leader, of course, for 30 years of the Ebenezer community, and his colleague, the Reverend Israel Grinnell. But you probably don't know too much about Purrysburg's flamboyant Jean-Pierre Purry. And he was flamboyant. I mean, this guy was pretty amazing. As I got working on this more than 40 years ago, it struck me how single-minded this guy was in terms of what he wanted to do. I mean, Reverend Bolzius was too, for sure. But Purry has a little different story that I want to, let's start with him. Because I think his story is kind of intriguing in so many ways. His family can be traced back to the 14th century in the western state or canton of Switzerland. So this is France right here, and this is the canton of Neuchâtel. That's where his family lived for at least 5 centuries until he was born. His father and his family, contained a number of military and civic and religious leaders over the years, the centuries in Neuchâtel. And his father was an innkeeper and a skilled pewter craftsman, like his father and his father before him. Purry was born in 1675, never knew his biological father. His father died before he was a year old. And he grew up in this canton. When he was 18 years old in 1693, he received an appointment as a tax collector and customs agent, but was dismissed the following year. Now, I don't know if that was because of inexperience. I could never figure out why he got fired, essentially, but he did. That didn't end his career at all. In fact, it probably just kind of got him going. because he then, over the next 14 years, he had married into a very prominent Neuchâtel family. He and his wife had 8 kids over the next 14 years, but only 4 survived into young adulthood. Again, the infant mortality rate, even in Switzerland, was really quite high at this particular time. Little is known for sure about Purry's activities between about 1695, which when he was 20, and 1709. Although some evidence exists to indicate that he may have become involved in various commercial ventures and maybe even served as a mercenary soldier. You've heard perhaps great stories of the Swiss mercenary soldiers. They were essentially neutral, so they would kind of farm themselves out to other countries or kingdoms that needed some soldiering, and he may have been involved in something like that in some other country. We do know that in May of 1709, the King of Prussia was the kind of the foundation state of modern Germany, right? But the King of Prussia, who ruled Neuchâtel at the time, appointed Purry as mayor of a town in the northeastern part of the canton. Again, he's quite young at this particular point in time, and he, with this appointment, again, the king appointed him, so he's got pretty high status in terms of folks of that era. But while it seemed like things were going well for him politically, his personal life tanked. A fire destroyed part of his home and also a commercial property that he owned. He was involved in a wine exporting business at this point in his life, and that also went belly up. He became so heavily indebted that folks finally, in fact, some of his own family members said, please don't let him be mayor anymore. He's got to make some money, raise his kids here. And so he's actually relieved of his responsibilities. This didn't stop Purry at all. He decided, well, okay, I'll cut my losses and try to find a living somewhere else. So in 1713, he applied for involvement with the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a major international trading company run out of the Netherlands. That was kind of the home office. And they, at that point, controlled the East Indies, called the Dutch East Indies. Okay, we call it Indonesia today. They also actually claimed Australia at this particular time, but didn't settle it yet. So he ended up in Batavia, which today is modern-day Jakarta, kind of in the state of Java. This is the island of Java. Jakarta or Batavia is right in that particular area. He ended up there after spending some time in the Cape Verde Islands, which are just off the coast of North Africa, and then also spent some time in South Africa on his journey to this final location in Indonesia. He remained in Batavia until about 1717 and pursued various endeavors, all kinds of stories about what he did. I mean, if he did all those things, he wouldn't have time to sleep. But he was involved in all kinds of different things, religious, secular, civic, and also military. He may have also at this time taken a trip to New Holland or Australia at this during these 3 or 4 years that he's in this area of Indonesia. His observations during these travels and his burning ambition to achieve great things, and he did have burning ambitions to achieve great things, transformed him into a tireless advocate for the colonization of unoccupied lands, unoccupied by the Dutch or the English or the French. He based his theories of colonization and his whole plan to develop colonies in some of these other parts of the world on a theory of climatology that was ingenious as it was wrong. He actually built on the theories of other folks. Folks had thought for a number of years that there's maybe some kind of connection between kind of latitude lines, how far north or south you are of the equator, and soil productivity, these sorts of things. What Purry did is he kind of put these things together because he researched this thing. This guy was, again, an indefatigable researcher. And he came up with his own theory. And he said, essentially, there are parts of the world that are more conducive to soil productivity. And so he put together the idea of heat and sunlight and climate and soil productivity and latitude lines and came up with a theory that at the 33 degree of north and south latitude, because at either side of the equator, that's where you can get really productive land. And a productive land means money for commercial empires, and he thought the Dutch East India Company was all for that. So he writes a proposal to the leader of the Dutch East India Company in Batavia in 1718, and he says, look, my theory and he was so convinced he was right. My theory says, if we plant a colony here in South Africa, this place is called Kaffraria. It means literally the land of the Bantu people, African people. But the Dutch hadn't yet colonized this area, but they had claim to it. And if you look at the latitude line, this is the 30th degree of latitude right here. So 33 would be right in this particular area. And he said the same thing about Holland, or Australia today, right? He said, okay, this area of Holland is right along that 33rd degree of north latitude, what he called the 5th climate zone. And so in this proposal, and it's really quite a thick proposal, he writes all this stuff down and says, listen, I want to make you guys rich, okay? Because this is where the best land is and that sort of thing. So he actually gets an audience before the head of the company in Batavia, because he just thought sure that the Dutch East India Company would buy this because it's going to be money for them. Well, the governor not only said, nah, I'm not crazy about this idea, he actually more or less kicked Purry out of the East Indies because Purry wouldn't let go. He kept saying, you've got to follow this. This is a great idea. Of course, he didn't want to be in charge of everything. And the leader just got so tired of listening to him, said, you're out of here, buddy. So he actually kicked him out of the Dutch East Indies. He goes back to Amsterdam, okay, which is where the head office was located. He gets back to Amsterdam, and he was so convinced he was right. He said, you know what? I'm going to write a second proposal. I'm going to give it right to the big cheese folks in Amsterdam. And so he did. So he writes a whole another big proposal, again, 50, 60 pages. And this time, he's listened to by these folks. And they said, well, let's think about that. That's not a bad idea at all. And they thought about it for about a year or so. In fact, they were supposed to move on it. And ultimately, though, they decided we're not going to worry about it at all. Okay, so they also said no to him. As an intriguing sidebar, these two memoirs that he wrote, actually, some people think that this is where Jonathan Swift got the idea for Gulliver's Travels, because in Purry's writings, he talks about, especially, let's go back to this one, where he wanted to build a colony right here, just off the coast of Australia. That was where Gulliver got shipwrecked, on those little islands there. And some people think that Swift built Gulliver's Travels at least partially around what Purry thought, because Purry also said that there might be giants living there. And if you remember about what happened to Gulliver, right? He ran into one island where there are all kind of giants. Just an interesting side note that I thought might be kind of intriguing for you to know. Anyway, that may be interesting, but the other folks that were in charge of the Dutch East India Company said, forget it, we're not going to be interested in that. Well, you think he's been rejected twice, kind of made fun of. You think, I'm giving up. No, not Purry. So he decides, I'm going to go to Paris and I'm going to talk to the French, because they had a big empire too, right? So he goes to Paris, and he actually gets appointed as a director general, kind of a leadership position in one of the largest trading companies in France. This is like 1719, 1720 or so. And he approaches the French. He said, you know what? You guys got a colony here in Louisiana. And look, here's the 30th degree of north latitude. Here's the 35th. And where's Louisiana? In Alabama. Okay? So there's that 5th climate zone. So he says, well, just recast it. We won't go to Australia. We won't go to South Africa. We'll go to Louisiana, and we'll plant a good colony for you folks. And of course, all I'm asking for is some land and all that sort of stuff. And it looked like that the French might buy it too. But then in 1720, there was a major financial collapse in France, especially around colonization. And Purry got caught in it. And so did the company he was in charge of. So guess what? The French said no too. Well, again, stymied 3 times by 2 of the largest empires in the world, didn't deter Purry in the least. So he turned his attention now to the largest and most powerful, Great Britain, right? The biggest empire in the world. He had to retool it though, right? Because now you're not going to put colonies where the French are trying to colonize. You're not going to put a colony where the French are. You got to put colonies where the British are. Well, guess where the Carolinas are? That's the 30th degree of north latitude. There's the 35th down there, and there's Carolina. So he retools his idea and approaches the British ambassador, a guy named Horace Walpole. Some of you may recognize that name, a very popular, very important figure in early modern Britain. He approaches Horace Walpole and says, listen, I got a great deal for you guys. And so he puts his idea out here, retools it, talks about his theory of sunlight and heat and degrees of north latitude and south latitude and such. And actually is then, Walpole thinks enough of it, he sends it off to the Secretary of State, the Duke of Newcastle, Secretary of State for the British Empire, and he thought it was okay too. So guess who he sent it to? Sir Isaac Newton, a name you might remember, okay? So Newton looked at Purry's proposal, said, you know, there's possibility, we need to explore it a little bit, but there's possibility here. And so this looked like a real opportunity. So then what Purry does is he, again, retools this. There's another proposal now, this is to the Duke of Newcastle, who's the Secretary of State for the whole British Empire, puts it forward in 1724. By the way, this is the first time the term Georgia is used for the lands south of the Savannah River. South and east of the Savannah River, or west of the Savannah River. So he's the one that kind of coins the term Georgia initially. Well, over the next year or two, it sounded like this was going to work out. There was some problems in South Carolina with, there was a major Indian war that had been fought, and of course, fear of slave insurrection, these sorts of things. So it looked like this was going to work out. They gave him kind of the okay. He goes back to Neuchâtel and said, hey, guess what? I'm going to build a great colony. Come with me. Switzerland was having a lot of emigres because of religious persecution and other kinds of financial issues. And so there were a lot of people that signed up for this, right? Just when it looked like this was going to work itself out, it had to work itself through the whole bureaucracy of the British government. Just when he got a whole bunch of folks interested in this, ready to go, and at the last minute, the British government said, nope, we're not going to do that. Okay? 4 strikes, right? Anybody else would say, nuts to this. I'm going home to my wife and kids. Forget this noise. Nope, not Purry. Between 1726 and 1730, there's a realignment of the government of South Carolina. And finally, the government realized that they really did need some settlement out here off the Savannah River because, again, of so many dangers, foreign and domestic. And so the governor of South Carolina at that point really seems to sign off on this. What does Purry do? He comes over. He hadn't been over to South Carolina yet. He comes over in 1731 and comes out here in the middle of the summer. Okay, so it's summer in South Carolina in 1731. He comes out just south of where you are here. There's a place called the Great Yamasee Bluff. And he said, that's right where the 33rd degree of north latitude is, or close enough, perhaps. The South Carolina government said, fine, that sounds good, go for it. And they finally signed off on it. Purry gets back to Charlestown, at this point, and writes another document, okay? And this document is to kind of encourage South Carolinians because, again, they're afraid of the French over the mountains, they're afraid of the Spaniards down in Florida, they're afraid of Native Americans, they're afraid of potential slave rebellion. So they're saying, okay, we're going to get somebody on the frontier. They can kind of guard us. And if the attacks come, they can let us know down in the low country where all the rich folks were, and they can save our bacon, more or less. And so it looked like things were going to work out. And so he goes back now to Neuchâtel and revises his tract that he had actually published in Charlestown before he left. This comes out, this document in French was for the folks who were going to go with him to South Carolina, okay? So he publishes this thing, and people sign up, even though there was a few years before this real problem, obviously, and he gets all kinds of folks that are very interested in coming. The first group of folks that settle in Purrysburg, and again, a lot of them are French Huguenots that had fled France because of persecutions. Some of the French Reformed folks from Switzerland, some are German Reformed, some are German Lutheran, some are even Italian Waldensians, who were also a persecuted religious group. But they'd start coming in 1732. The way it worked out for Purry is he became the major landowner in Purrysburg Township. Now, there was never a Purrysburg Parish, as this map says, but there was a Purrysburg Township, that's what it was called. And he owned about 20,000 acres. That was part of the deal. I'll bring these folks over, you give me a bunch of land. He not only had land, he was also the chief kind of judicial officer and the chief military officer. So this guy finally had arrived. He got it all. He got land, he got status, he got power, he got a military title. I mean, what else can you want, right? And so it looked like things were going to go really well for him. And the intriguing thing about Purry and the Salzburg settlement is that there were connections before either of those groups had ever come to South Carolina, because Purry first met Reverend Bolzius and Greenough in Dover just before they departed for Georgia with the first shipment of Salzburgers. And what ship did they come over on? Your first shipment of Salzburgers? The Purrysburg. That was the name of the ship they came over on. So in December 33, the first group hits Savannah and kind of works their way up here. Purry was also well acquainted with many of those that were instrumental in the founding of Georgia, including the group of reform-minded clergy headed by the Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray on the left here. Thomas Bray was one of the major philanthropists and headed a whole group of clergy folks that were really interested in colonization and other kinds of very civic improvements and that sort of thing. The associates of Dr. Bray actually invited Purry to speak with them in London, and he talked all about Purrysburg and stuff, and they gave him 200 pounds sterling, which is a lot of money at that particular point in time, for his colony. And they also, once Dr. Bray died, they also gave him a bunch of gave Purry a bunch of his books from his library. So they knew each other quite well. He also knew Oglethorpe. He and Oglethorpe knew each other quite well. Oglethorpe, of course, on the right there. And in fact, they even hit a bargain. Oglethorpe negotiated with Purry to buy land across the river. So Oglethorpe actually had a whole bunch of land that Purry had given him out of the township land, again, for favors and that sort of thing. So they knew each other quite well. So with all these connections, in addition to their close proximity on the hostile frontier British settlement, you might think the two settlements would develop a close relationship based on mutual need, Ebenezer, Purrysburg. Indeed, there were some of these indicators of such a relationship. For example, in 1733, just as the first shipment of Salzburg immigrants comes, the Purrysburg Militia Company helped protect Georgia's settlements when a threat of a Spanish invasion of the colony through Savannah seemed imminent. Purrysburg became an important link in the communication between the Reverend Bolzius and Georgia officials such as Oglethorpe and Colonel William Stevens, who really kind of helped get your Salzburgers kind of settled up here. The Purrysburg Wharf also facilitated the transfer of provisions from Savannah, the Savannah storehouse, to Ebenezer along the Savannah River. As you know, old Ebenezer existed on a creek that was really not navigable. So the first 3 years that your ancestors were here, it was really tough to get supplies to them. So what the storehouse keeper in Savannah did was he shipped all the supplies up to the Purrysburg Wharf, and then your ancestors came down, picked it up from Purrysburg, took it across the river and up to Old Ebenezer. Even after Old Ebenezer was abandoned for this site, Purrysburg still remained an important transport site for supplies and certainly communication links with other parts of Georgia as well as South Carolina. Lots of artisans and laborers from Purrysburg. There were a lot of folks in Purrysburg that were trained in various kinds of crafts, tailors, cobblers, those kind of folks, as well as manual laborers. And a lot of them came over to Ebenezer. Bolzius hired a lot of those folks to kind of work in Ebenezer and help your ancestors get things going. In fact, they helped Ebenezer settlers build the only grinding mill in Georgia in 1740. So the first grinding mill here at New Ebenezer was at least partially built with Purrysburg help. The Purrysburg doctor, Johann Friedrich Holzendorf, offered his medical expertise to Ebenezer residents. In fact, one of the things he did a lot was bleed people. And you may realize that back in that day, they thought that the health of the body, human body, was based on the fact that you have a balance between 4 bodily humors or 4 bodily fluids, blood and phlegm, those kind of things. And so if you got a temperature, you got flushed, right? Well, your blood was out of balance, so he'd bleed people. In fact, that's how George Washington died. They bled him too much, and he didn't have enough blood to keep going. But they were real appreciative of Holzendorf and his ministrations there. Bolzius was initially really quite taken with Purrysburg. I pulled this quote from the detailed reports that you all know about. This town of Purrysburg is built up high on the bank of the river. And since a good many people of means are living here, it's hoped that it will become a fine city in a short time. The people here tend to their fields and gardens with much diligence, and you can already buy meat, eggs, and garden vegetables here more easily than in Savannah. People here were very friendly toward us. So again, you have this sense that, boy, this is going to be a great relationship. We're both on the frontier. We both need each other. The Ebenezer Lutherans also came to the aid of Purrysburg residents in numerous ways. It didn't just go one way. For example, Reverend Bolzius provided religious services to a lot of the German speakers in Purrysburg. You know why? Because the Purrysburg minister could only speak French. Okay? And so the few German Lutherans that were there, the German Reformed folks, they couldn't even understand what the service was all about when it was done in Purrysburg. And so Bolzius and Grunau preached to them, sometimes in Purrysburg, sometimes the Purrysburg Germans would come over here and worship with the Salzburgers. Purrysburg children were also allowed to enroll in the Ebenezer school. The educational system in Purrysburg was really almost non-existent until after the Revolutionary War. And so a lot of the kids were allowed to come over here from Purrysburg to work and to take advantage of the schooling opportunities over here. In 1744, Bolzius hired a Purrysburg widow to instruct some of the Salzburg young women in the production of silk to begin the industry in Georgia. That's kind of the beginning of the silk industry in Georgia. Ebenezer settlers also helped a Purrysburg settler who, his land had flooded and his cattle were strewn all over the place. So a lot of the Ebenezer folks came over and helped him get those steers back where they needed to be. And there were also, of course, a number of marriages, a lot of intermarriage between Purrysburg settlers and the settlers here at Ebenezer. But there are also a lot of obstacles to a close relationship between the two. First and foremost was the ethnic and religious chasm between Purrysburg and Ebenezer. Now today, Lutherans and Presbyterians and other Reformed folks get along pretty well, okay? I mean, we get along pretty well. My wife and I are kind of West Coast Presbyterians, and we get along fine with Lutherans. We have a lot of Lutheran friends, right? Lutherans are my best friends. But back then, that wasn't that way. It was quite dicey. In fact, Bolzius was really concerned about the French Reformed of the settlement, of Purrysburg settlement. There was a minister at Purrysburg, Henry Francois Schiffel. He was a minister in Purrysburg from the mid-1730s to the 1750s, and he was the one that only spoke French. And so whenever he preached in French, and a lot of these German speakers in Purrysburg didn't understand him a bit. But Bolzius thought that he was too involved in kind of worldly concerns. I mean, he had a plantation, he had some slaves, and he also tended to marry people outside his parish, which was not what you were supposed to do. You could only marry people that resided in your parish. And Schiffel decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go outside the color outside the lines, if you will. And of course, he's preaching in a marriage ceremonies for folks that maybe don't even understand French. So there's a real problem there. Most notable of the run-ins that Bolzius and Grunau had with Schiffel about this practice of marrying outside the parish involved none other than John Wesley, founder of Methodism, who had a personal experience with the Purrysburg minister. Wesley began ministering in Savannah to residents in early 1736. So Purrysburg had been there for about 4 years, Ebenezer about 3. And he became one of 3 suitors to an 18-year-old young woman named Sophie Hopke. This is a really intriguing story. I thought you might get a kick out of this. Because Wesley got ticked off at Schiffel just like Bolzius and Grunau did. Because, well, let me tell you the story first, and then you'll see how this worked out. In March of 37, Sophie Hopke mentioned to Wesley that she was ending the relationship with one of the three suitors. Well, it's a good thing because the guy was in jail. You know, you don't want your 18-year-old daughter marrying a jailbird already, right? So she gives up him, but there was another guy that was pursuing her, but she didn't have any real feelings for him. She thought he was a nice guy and all, but do you marry somebody because you think he's a nice guy? Perhaps not. But she was kind of in the situation where she was attracted to Wesley, but Wesley had kind of taken a vow that he probably won't get married while he's doing missionary work here in the colonies, right? Well, Sophie also had a rough situation in her home. Her parents were gone. She was living with her aunt and uncle, and they didn't have a real good relationship at times. And in early March of 1737, they actually were going to kick her out of the house. And I don't know much more about it than that. They asked Wesley to come over, and he came and talked to her, and she was crying, trying to figure out what she should do. He went home. He left her that night. She stayed at her aunt and uncle's house. He comes over the next day to see how she is. And by the way, his affection for her is really obvious from his journals. If you read Wesley's journals, you could tell he was sweet on Sophie Hopke. He was like 32 or something, but he thought she was pretty nice. But he didn't say anything to her, you know. So he kind of consoles her that night, leaves, comes back the next day, and her aunt informs him that she got engaged that night, the night before. Well, Wesley's okay, now what? So he has conversations with her. They have conversations the next 3 days. And you can almost tell Hopke would give up this other guy if Wesley would just make a move. He didn't. So this is where Purrysburg comes into the situation. So she's engaged to be married. Wesley is attracted to her, but he doesn't make any move toward her. She is going, well, what do I do here? And on Friday, March 11th, 1737, Hopke, her fiance, and another couple traveled upriver to Purrysburg because she knew that Bolsius and Greenough wouldn't marry her. So they travel up to Purrysburg, and 285 years ago today, the Purrysburg minister Scheffel marries her and her fiance and then this other couple. Well, Wesley just went ballistic. And this is where, again, he's making common cause with Greenough and Bolsius. He writes a letter to Scheffel and says essentially, quote, "You've got to abstain from such functions. It just wasn't what you should be doing," okay? It gets better, okay? Then he decides that he's going to notify the Bishop of London what Scheffel is doing, because Scheffel was supposed to be an Anglican minister, so you go to the Bishop of London and get him censored or something. But that wasn't enough. In mid-April, he took the high road from Purrysburg to Charlestown to meet with the leader of the Anglican Church in the colony of South Carolina about what Scheffel was doing. Well, that's also the same route he took a few months later when he had to get out of Georgia and get out of the colonies completely because Hopke's husband had filed suit against Wesley because he would not serve communion to them in Savannah. He was still so upset. So that's why Wesley left the colonies and went back to England. Anyway, I thought it was kind of an intriguing story. Maybe I got off on it. Bolsius was also not real crazy about the intermarriages between the Salzburg Lutherans and the Purrysburg Reformed folks. But he recognized as late as September of 1739 that Purrysburg was still the only place where Ebenezer residents could find wives. I mean, again, the pickings are slim out here on the frontier, right? So you got to go where there are folks. And as late as 1739, so that was Purrysburg. Then there was a problem with the liquor trade. As you know, Georgia initially was a dry colony. South Carolina was not, okay? And Purrysburg, just down there a few miles, and there were taverns right along the river, so guess where a lot of the Ebenezer folks went on Saturday night? Same place Savannah goes. Anyway, so there was that. And then there were again a lot of Purrysburg folks that would come up and serve the Ebenezer folks, but they weren't all kind of sterling citizens. There was one fellow especially, his name was John Jacob Reck, again a German speaker. He was a cobbler, again quite good cobbler, and so he would come up and make shoes for the settlers here in Ebenezer. The problem was that he was not a stellar citizen at all. In fact, the Reverend Bolzius found a person here in Ebenezer that would be his apprentice. So, if he learned to make shoes, they wouldn't have to hire Reck anymore. Well, he mistreated this apprentice. I treated him really terribly. Reck drank a lot. He was drunk a lot. He abused his wife. And at one point, he actually recruited some Ebenezer settlers for a military expedition that were either sick or were not physically able to do that, because he got a commission for everybody that he signed up. So he was not the stellar citizen at all. He detested Reck, Bolzius did, but again, they needed him because they didn't have the ability to make their own shoes, at least at that particular point. Then there was the story of the French Reformed Purrysburg doctor, Jean-Baptiste Bourgoin. Now, what's intriguing about Bourgoin is he was highly qualified. I mean, he was a surgeon in the Duke of Marlborough's army before he came to Purrysburg. So he really knew his stuff. He was considered a good doctor. But Bolzius remained skeptical of his medical expertise. He wasn't impressed at all with how he treated the Germans in Purrysburg. He said at one point that he checked on some of these Germans that Bourgoin had treated, and he said, quote, "Some peace and quiet and medical attention they found in Ebenezer." So they would come to Ebenezer to escape Bourgoin. At least that's the way Reverend Bolzius saw it. He did seem to get on Bolzius' good side to some extent every once in a while. After successfully treating 3 Salzburgers in 1741, Bolzius wrote kind of admirably about him, but he also suggested that one of his successful treatment folks should have probably gotten a second opinion, because he didn't think that even though the person got better, he wasn't too impressed with Bourgoin's treatment. He found it extremely difficult to trust Bourgoin's diagnosis and treatments. In 1741, again, Bolzius visited a severely ill Purrysburg woman, writing that, quote, "The doctor has probably ruined her even more." After expressing some appreciation again for Bourgoin, Bolzius confided to his diary that the, quote, "surgeon has little medical knowledge." Well, the irony is that Ebenezer seemed to rely more on Bourgoin than it did Holzendorf over the years. But what was the tension? Well, the tension, of course, was that he was French Reformed. And that was an issue at that particular point in time. But the fact is that both Ebenezer needed Purrysburg and Purrysburg needed Ebenezer in that first 40 or 50 years of their existence here on the southern frontier. The Revolutionary War brought privation and dislocation to both settlements, as you all know, for Ebenezer, certainly for Purrysburg. From early January to late March of 1779, Purrysburg was actually the bivouac, or the headquarters, of Benjamin Lincoln's Southern Department of the Continental Army. So you have almost 4,000 soldiers across the river and through the woods there a few miles away. And of course, there's all kinds of stuff that happens. They confiscate property, they knock down fences of Purrysburg settlers. It was just a mess. But it got worse, because when Lincoln left, he and his army left to go to Charlestown in late March of 1779, guess who came after him? The British. Previs crossed as you know, the British were here, right? They crossed the river and destroyed Purrysburg. They pretty much destroyed the whole town. Ebenezer recovered, and Purrysburg kind of never really did. Ebenezer, I think, in terms of its vitality, its ability to kind of integrate itself into the colony of Georgia, had eclipsed Purrysburg's ability to do that even before the war. Why did that happen? Though both Ebenezer and Purrysburg had strong and decisive initial leadership, Purry died only 4 years after bringing the first settlers here. So he was gone much of the time bringing more transports of folks over. So he wasn't very present in the township itself. And on the other hand, you have the Reverend Bolzius, who was almost for 30 years was the leader of this colony over here. I think that is a big reason why Ebenezer succeeded and Purrysburg essentially dissipated. I think another reason is that, again, you have a very strong sense of community here in Ebenezer. Salzburg, German Lutherans, okay? They came from the same place, they had the same faith, they had known each other in the old world, so there's a real strong sense of commonality, a common purpose here. And again, because Purrysburg was split between Germans and French and some Italians even, and even a few English people, it was really hard to construct that community over the course of time up to the Revolution. I think a third reason is that the political leadership of Georgia worked really hard to make the Salzburgers feel welcome. Now, they may not always have done the best job, but I think they did a lot better job than the folks in South Carolina did. And let me give you a couple of examples of that, if I can. This is the layout of Purrysburg in 1732. So here's the Savannah River. And there's all the town lots, okay? Those are all the town lots for the Purrysburg settlers. Now, if you notice right down here, you can't read that, I know, but you know what this says? Impassable river swamp. So a great deal of this part of Purrysburg, which is kind of the center of town, if you will, it was right at the fall line, right? So, or the tidewater. So if they got flooding at all, or if you had a high tide, a lot of those lands were flooded for those Purrysburg settlers. But there's something else that goes on too. This is that section. Here's that term, Impassable River Swamp. And what I did here is I took a look at who got what town lots. So the lots you see in white are lots that were set aside for French-speaking residents. The kind of squiggly ones were the ones set aside for German settlers, German-speaking settlers, okay? And the ones, you see a few of them here that are actually split. Half that's French and half is German. Well, if you're trying to build a town and you have French speakers right next to German speakers and they can't communicate, how do you develop a sense of community? And this is only one example. I mean, it took years for some of these Purrysburg folks to get land. And the ones who had land here had to try to exchange their lots for lots further in because they get flooded all the time. They couldn't use those town lots at all. So getting land transfers was really difficult, and Purrysburg should have been declared a parish in the 1730s. It wasn't until 1747 that it was declared a parish, and that gave it representation in the Commons House of Assembly in South Carolina. They didn't get that for almost 15 years after they were settled. Purrysburg really declines between about the 1770s. It has some kind of a renaissance in the 18 teens and 20s. As steamships started to go up and down the Savannah River, and they stopped at the Purrysburg landing and that sort of thing. But then when the railroads came through and ferries were developed, they kind of bypassed Purrysburg. In fact, when the first railroad comes through, that's when Hardeeville on the other side of the river became a fairly substantial town because that's where the railroad stopped. It completely missed Purrysburg. The final death knell of Purrysburg, of course, was the Civil War because Sherman's coming from Atlanta with his 60,000 troops, a lot of them break off and go up the Savannah River and just totally destroy whatever is left at Purrysburg. And so by the 1880s, this is what the Purrysburg Cemetery looked like, which wasn't much. And today, as many of you know, that's all that's left of Purrysburg. Okay, there's a little cross that was placed. This is the Yamasee Bluff right here. This little cross was placed by the Huguenot Society of South Carolina back in 1941. And that's all that's left of Purrysburg. So again, I applaud you and your ancestors for persevering. You had plenty of adversity over here on this side of the Savannah River too. And it would have been fun for me to have been able to see more connections between Purrysburg and Ebenezer. But again, I think that they needed each other, but there was always this kind of hesitancy, I think, on the part of the leadership of Ebenezer. And again, Purrysburg kind of went its own direction.